sacred text is from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter, beginning at the 22nd verse. Jesus insisted that the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side. Having sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, remaining there alone as night fell. Meanwhile, the boat, already 1,000 yards from shore, was being tossed about in the waves which had been raised by the fierce winds. At about 3 a.m, Jesus came walking toward them on the lake. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and in their fear they began to cry out. Jesus hastened to reassure them. "Don't worry, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter spoke up and said, "If it is really you, tell me to come to you across the water." "Come," Jesus said. So Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. He began to sink and cried out, "Save me!" Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and caught Peter. "You have so little faith," Jesus said to him. "Why did you doubt?" Once they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat showed great reverence, declaring to Jesus, "You are indeed God's own." La palabra de Dios.
Gracias a Dios.
One of today's themes in the sacred text is trust, or maybe to coin a cliche, let go and let God. And I'm embarking on a number of parts of trust here, trusting in technology, which right now, there we go. I decided for the first time, I haven't preached in a while, but I was going to try, rather than to be stuck to paper, which I'm much more comfortable with, and then having to maneuver both of those things, I was just going to let it all fly and try to figure out how to use technology. And so hopefully this will work. The other element of trust in today's sermon is something I learned from the pastor, the first pastor I ever worked with, who was a friend of mine, and I was early in seminary. My first year of seminary, actually I hadn't even started seminary, I was studying for the ministry, but I was helping him out in a small beach town in Southern California. And it was a small congregation, and primarily they had worship service and a youth group. And I was helping him out on Sunday evenings with the youth group. And that was kind of getting my feet wet as I was thinking about and preparing for ministry. And you've got to realize that the very thing that I was petrified with was ever speaking publicly. I literally took C's in foreign language in school because I wouldn't give up public demonstration, even if it was to get up in class and say, "Buenos dias, clase," and sit down. That would be your demonstration. I was petrified. So Alan, knowing that, really pulled a dirty trick on me. He was going on a 2-week vacation, and he just mentioned to me, "Would you cover for me?" And I assumed, "Oh, sure, I can take care of the youth group on Sunday evenings." And on his way out the door to the airport, he just happened to mention, "Oh, and by the way, you're preaching on Sundays." So that got me into preaching and following many of the things that Alan did. So one of the things that he always used to do is he wrote his sermon, just sat down and wrote it on Monday, and then threw it in a drawer. Just thought about it, let it ruminate, and then he might have did a little more reading. In midweek, he would just sit down and write the sermon full about. Again, with the same process of letting the mind work, maybe doing a little research. And then by the end of the week, he would write it out full, and then he would reduce it to an outline of like 1 page with bullet points, and then just speak from that that 1 sheet of paper with those bullet points. So I'm going to try that today too. I've done this twice in my 50 years of preaching, and one time didn't work out so well, and the other time it worked out well. So who knows what you're going to get today. But we have to look at this text that we have this morning, and I think for us to even begin to understand it, we have to look at the audience that Matthew was writing for. The people that he was writing for were victims of centuries of colonization. They had seen the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, just to name a few, conquer their land, dominate their land, and colonize the land. And they experienced exploitation. And we think we have a wealth gap today. The people in Jesus' community in Palestine, we couldn't hold a candle to it, because there were 2 classes, the uber wealthy and the beggars. There was no middle class whatsoever. The country was also in turmoil because they had existed under the domination of these colonizers. Some people, the landed gentry and the religious leaders, they survived by collaborating. And that meant they would do whatever the Roman authorities wanted them to do. Then there were others who wanted to just flee. And those were the Essenes that kind of like, no, we're going to withdraw from this turmoil. And then there were others, the zealots, who were so angry and frustrated by this domination and the miserable shape that they were in, wanted to rebel. An armed rebellion is what they were looking for. And so that's kind of the context for this story that Jesus tells. The disciples, these followers of Jesus, were in turmoil. They were both oppressed by the economics, by the socio-political setup in Israel, but they were also impressed by what they saw in this person of Jesus and how he broke all the barriers and how he reached out to the outcast, and overwhelmed by the reaction to him. And also that Jesus rejected the mantle of a revolutionary leader. Because I'm sure a lot of those disciples and a lot of the people that flocked to Jesus, that's what they were looking for. Someone who would come along and overthrow the Roman oppressors. So Jesus' way of dealing with this must have confused them. And so when we look at this story, stories told of after one of Jesus' encounters with the crowds, where people thronged to him because he was healing the sick, he was feeding the hungry, he was doing wonderful things, and a lot of the people that were coming were so hurt. They were looking for that person who was going to come and overthrow their oppressors. And yet, that's not what Jesus was hoping to be for them. He was hoping for a different way. And so when Jesus rebuked the disciples when they wanted to turn him into that kind of leader, he simply said, I'm going to withdraw. Right now the turmoil is so great. He'd heard about John the Baptist being beheaded. He was in fear for his own life, I'm sure questioning about what direction he was heading. And so he needed a time apart. And he sent the disciples on ahead, told them to get in a boat and go across the lake. And so now we can hear that sacred story. Well into their journey across the lake, they were not making too much progress. There were choppy waves and wind was blowing. And they looked out and they saw, first they thought, it's a ghost. And they were filled with fear. And then someone said, is that you, Jesus? Well, remember, we're looking at this from today's scientific worldview, but we have to remember that the disciples had a different ancient worldview, where ghosts were real, where spirits were real, where people were in contest between forces of good and evil. And the sea in particular was a place of great fear, where there were monsters and ghosts. And so just to be out on the sea, or lake actually, because this is not anything like a sea, it's only about 3 miles by 6 miles, so that's not what we would call a sea. But nonetheless, they're out, far out, and they see this ghost and they're afraid. And then Peter looks out at the ghost and he's not quite sure, and he says, Jesus, if that's you, call to me. And so Jesus calls Peter, he summons him to come out of the boat, that place of safety, and to get into the water. Peter gets out, he starts, and he's moving towards Jesus, and then suddenly he becomes aware of the turmoil around. The waves are sloshing, the wind, and he begins to go under. But the scripture says that immediately Jesus grabs his hand and pulls him back into safety. And they're suddenly in the boat together with the disciples. And the waters are calm. And so that's when the disciples can look and say, you indeed are God's own. Because you calm the forces of evil, you calm even the seas. But as I was preparing the sermon, I was thinking about the various elements in this story. There's the boat, an obvious symbol of safety and security. We've often talked about this building as being like an upside-down boat. And historically, a boat has been a symbol for the church, an ark, a place of safety. And there's also the waters, which in the ancient world was filled with evil spirits, wild and untamed and chaotic and unpredictable. And I really focus on the waters and the chaos, because I was thinking that really reflects an awful lot of what our life is like right now in our world. It's in chaos. I rarely watch the evening news because I'm a news junkie. And if I do, I get sucked in and then I get angry and frustrated with all that's going on. But just a week or so ago, I happened to turn on the evening news. And the headline story starts out with wildfires in several places in this country and around the world. They spent about 5 minutes talking about that and the changes in climate. And then I read an article by a climate scientist who said climate change obviously is real, and it's happening so fast right now that's exceeding all of the other predictions. And he was saying that pretty soon we are going to get into a place called climate chaos, where scientists can no longer even begin to predict what is going to happen. Think about the other kinds of chaos that we're seeing in our world. Addiction, racism, white supremacy, houselessness, political free fall. We go on ad nauseum. Well, how can anyone in that kind of a situation leave their comfort zone and delve into those waters of chaos and where there's threat and there's just no seeming way out? But in the scripture, Jesus calls Peter and invites him to get out of the boat and into the water. Well, why would Jesus do that? Maybe more importantly, why would Peter do that? Well, let me tell you about one of my deepest fears. I have a real fear of water. I grew up in a sort of a concrete jungle. Didn't see a swimming pool till I would move to the suburbs. And to this day, I can't swim. Fast forward a few years, I'm married and I have 2 children. And when they were infants, my wife Kathy took them to Y for infant swimming lessons. And so you get in the water with the baby and you dunk them. And I would go along. And on 1 or 2 occasions when Kathy couldn't make it, I had to be in the water with the kids. And I was not terribly comfortable. But as one of the perks of taking that class, they offered free adult swimming lessons. So I thought, well, I'm going to try. So, and I went by myself because I didn't want to see anybody else to see me. So I was there with the instructor and we were standing right next to the side of the pool in the deep end, and I could kind of hold on to that and it would be okay. And so one of the first lessons is, so you've got to let go of the wall and put yourself out and float and let the water support you. Well, try as I might, I would do that. I'd try over and over again, and I'd just grab for the wall. And so I never learned to trust the water. Never learned that that water would hold me up. I can't swim today. I can doggy paddle, and if I fell into a pool, I could get to the side. But I'm not comfortable in water. And if I'm in any kind of a boat other than an ocean liner, I'm terrified. Because I just don't believe that the water will hold me up. And that, I think, is an interesting metaphor or analogy to my struggle with addiction for years and years and years. Because I never believed that if I let go and control, and of course, in my mind, drinking was under my control, I never would let go and trust that there was a better future and that there was a loving God out there. And so I tried and tried and tried and failed and failed and failed for years and years, until it was the unconditional love of this community and the trusting in a loving God that allowed me finally to let go. And once I let go of that need to be in control and trust that everything was going to be okay, even though, especially in early years of sobriety, there's all these promises that things are going to be wonderful, better than you ever imagined. And I sat there and under my breath, yeah, right, I don't believe that. But my experience over the years, and I have about 10 years clean and sober now, but my experience has been that with each passing year and with each thing that I just let go and try but let go and let God, I'm finding myself more able to let go of other things and trusting that it's going to be all right. Even sometimes not what I expected, not what I wanted, but it worked out. There's another thing that's interesting in this story to notice, and that's that Jesus is calling Peter not just to get out of the boat, but to come across the water, to come across the unknown, the untested, the fearful places, because that's where Jesus was. And if Jesus is there to hold us up, even as the storms of life assail us, and our comfort levels are stretched, maybe even broken, it's the nature of faith to be willing to throw oneself into a disorderly world and to expect to encounter Jesus there. It's the nature of faith, even a little faith. And it's interesting, in the text they talk about Jesus, we're often told, rebukes Peter by saying, "Oh, ye of little faith." Well, actually, the Greek doesn't mean that. It means something entirely different. It's a very, it's a nickname, a loving nickname, much like you might say, "Oh, way to go, little man." It's like taking a child and saying, "Oh, that's really great for what you were doing." And so when Jesus says little faith, he's talking about, "Oh, that's great, Peter. You're like a toddler in your faith." Not a rebuke, but just the recognition that he was young in his faith and he needed more time and more maturity for that faith to grow. And so we're called into this water, not just to test the water, but also to be in those places where Jesus is, at the margins. It's the nature of faith to wonder what other unimaginable outcomes might occur if we're willing to get into the water and move towards Jesus. What might we be called into messing with along with Jesus? What of our own thinking about boundaries and borders might be completely realigned because we've been in wrestling with the waters and the struggles there, and only to find it's something entirely different. Maybe this is the challenge for us as leaven, salt, and light, as we begin a new round of listening. What would it mean for us to get out of the boat and to go into the unknown, the community, into the depths of the water? Because we know that's really where Jesus is. What would it mean to get out of that safety and that comfort zone and to listen, but not only listen, but to learn from the people that are in the water at a different place, or maybe in deep waters? Maybe we would discover, as Peter discovered, that Jesus is there at the boundaries. And the boundaries are being redrawn, always extending life-giving stability when chaos gets too great. And whenever chaos looks like it might have the upper hand. So if we can trust in the water and trust in the one who calms the seas, to enter into the chaos and knowing that we will be upheld. That's what this lesson says to me. It's what I've learned from this community, and trusting in oneself, trusting in the community, and trusting even in the face of the unknown makes life so much better. Amen. So as you all know, one of the practices in this community is to have an intentional conversation with someone, a conversation around the question that I'll provide in a little while. But it's also a time, this is an invitation, so if you would rather meditate, rather go out in the sunroom, have some coffee or tea, or whatever you'd like. You're also free to do that. But I would strongly invite you to find someone, maybe someone you haven't talked to in more than a day or two, and maybe look at these two questions. So, what would getting out of your boat look like to you? And what is it that you fear most in the water? Maybe, and the other, just to throw in, give you lots of options, maybe think about a time in your life when you did get out of your boat. And what happened? So, 5 or 10 minutes, and find someone you'd like to talk to.